Good afternoon, everyone. This hearing will come to order. I want to thank everyone for being here today. This is our second IRS hearing of the year. Our hearing in February focused on the IRS operations, whereas today our hearing will focus on the IRS 2015 budget request. So welcome back, Commissioner. We appreciate your willingness to come see us again. Similar to the IRS 2012, 2013, and 2014 budget request, the administration is seeking discretionary spending for the IRS well above the discretionary caps that are under the current law. So absent a change in either the Budget Control Act or the Ryan-Murray Agreement, $480 million of the IRS request is both meaningless and pointless. Because if the $480 million is of importance to the administration, then the President would have found a way to pay for it from the $1.014 trillion allowable under the Ryan-Murray, rather than use a gimmick that the budget committees have rejected now for 4 consecutive years. Perhaps even more troubling, the service is asking this committee for language to pay IRS employees bigger salaries and bigger bonuses than are allowed under the civil service system, and also to eliminate some language that we put in the omnibus bill last year. Specifically, the language that we put in to prohibit the IRS from targeting groups from additional scrutiny based on their ideological beliefs is not there. We put in language to prohibit the IRS from targeting citizens of the United States for exercising their rights guaranteed under the First Amendment, and that language has been eliminated. We also had language that would prohibit the IRS from producing videos without being reviewed for cost, topic, tone, and purpose, and that's been eliminated as well. So on the face, Mr. Commissioner, your request appears to ask for a $1 billion increase in order for the IRS to silence the administration's critics and to make silly videos. And I'm sure that's not your intent. But I would like to hear why you propose to eliminate these good government provisions, which were intended to help restore credibility and confidence to the IRS. And as you can tell from the roughly 150,000 comments on the draft 501c4 regulation, Americans are still angry about the additional scrutiny that the IRS gave to certain organizations. So explaining how the inappropriate criteria came into use, how they were allowed to go on for years, and who is responsible for them is what is needed to assure the public that the IRS can administer the tax code in a partial and nonpartisan manner. Requesting a $1 billion increase, eliminating prohibitions against targeting that were negotiated by this committee, and proposing a new rule for the 501c4s before investigations by Congress and the Department of Justice have been completed will not build trust in the IRS, the Department of Treasury, or the federal government in general. So now let me turn to Ranking Member Serrano. And again, Commissioner, we thank you for being here today. Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to welcome our Internal Revenue Service Commissioner back to the subcommittee. It's been a whole 5 weeks since we last saw you, so welcome back. We're here today to discuss your fiscal year 2015 budget request, in which you request significant new resources in order to better do the job that we in Congress have given you. But before we do that, I think it is important to have some historical context. In fiscal year 2010, the IRS was funded at $12.146 billion. In fiscal year 2011, the first year the other side was in charge of the House, that number dropped $25 million to $12.121. Fiscal year 2012, that number was reduced even further to $11.8 billion. And in 2013, because of the sequester, the IRS was forced to operate at a level of $11.199 billion. Last year, we were able to restore some funding to the IRS, but the agency still funded at levels well below previous years. Since Republicans took over the House, there has been a cut of close to $1 billion in funding. I'm sure some of my colleagues think that cutting funding for the IRS is a good thing, but I'm sure some of them are proud of this effort. But I'm not sure we want to tax laws with no one able to answer questions when our constituents have them and with no one around to ensure justice for those who attempt to evade the law. And today I'm sure we'll hear complaints about the reduction in the level of service or the reduction in the ability of our taxpayer service centers to accept tax applications. Well, we need to be clear as to the reason why. We can't talk about conference waste all we want to do, but when you cut almost $1 billion in funding, then people should not be surprised when the IRS cannot do all that we ask of them. No one here debates that ensuring efficiency in any government agency is important, but at a certain point the level of cuts overwhelms the ability of an agency to streamline their operations, which is why your budget request is so important. Your request seeks to restore significant funding to the agency, both to help rebuild needed services and to help enforce some of the most abused areas of our tax code. You're asking for money to prevent identity theft and to address the backlog of cases where we know money is owed to the government. You ask for resources to implement the tax provisions of the Affordable Care Act and to expand audit coverage. In my mind, these all seem like important and worthy investments in the agency that brings in the vast majority of our nation's revenue. I know the IRS is an easy agency to beat up on, especially after last year's controversies, but it seems to me that it is much more responsible to ensure that we are adequately funding the agency rather than hindering its ability to function properly. Mr. Chairman, since you brought it up, I had not intended to bring it up. I think that the recent report that came out about the alleged abuses, the timing was excellent. It came right before this hearing, and maybe there was a reason for that. Secondly, I'm on record here 3, 4, 5, maybe even more times saying that if indeed abuses were committed against organizations or any groups, that I'm as outraged and upset and lack tolerance of it as much as any Republican or any American. But at the same time, we seem to know, we're pretty sure, that different groups were targeted, and why we continue to argue that only conservative or Tea Party groups were targeted only makes this hearing and these kinds of conversations much more difficult. So I would hope that as time goes on, people will stop politicizing this issue and get to the facts, number one, and number two, get to the point where we understand that the IRS is charged with a special responsibility. It must meet that obligation, and we must be supportive of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I see that we've been joined by the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Lowy, so I'd like to recognize her for any opening statement she might like to make.
Well, I certainly would like to thank Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano for holding this hearing. And I'd like to thank Commissioner Koskinen, a distinguished graduate of Duke University, for coming before the committee this afternoon. As we know, the IRS fiscal year 2015 budget request calls for $12.477 billion in funding, an increase of 10.5% above the FY14 enacted level. This includes $2.317 billion for taxpayer services, $639.25 million for pre-filing taxpayer assistance in education. In addition, the request includes $5.134 billion in enforcement initiatives. As we know, funding for enforcement not only holds tax frauds accountable, it also brings in more than 5-to-1 return on investment. I'm concerned that the Republican majority's efforts to continually underfund the IRS makes it easier for tax cheats to go undetected and more difficult for law-abiding members of the public to get questions answered and the resources they need from the IRS. And I want to also thank you, because I know you've been traveling around the country, visiting various offices, talking to employees, and trying to get as much information as you can so you could certainly do the job appropriately and continue your distinguished career. As we saw last year with the reports of inappropriate screening criteria, funds for proper training and taxpayer services are severely needed so that employees know proper procedures and, most important, American taxpayers can have confidence in the IRS. Commissioner Koskinen, to put it simply, you have a lot on your plate. In addition to the budget and Affordable Care Act implementation, this year, for the first time, gay and lesbian married taxpayers will be able to file jointly, as well as amend past tax returns. As some states, such as New York, recognize same-sex marriage, and some unfortunately do not, leading to more confusion for taxpayers who look to the IRS for guidance. I look forward to discussing some of these matters in more detail with you shortly, and thank you again for your service.
Thank you very much. Now we'll have some time for some questions. I almost forgot to call on the Commissioner for his opening statement. So if you could limit your remarks to about 5 minutes, you can certainly submit your written statement for the record, and apologize for almost not recognizing you. But please be recognized, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. Thank all of you for the opportunity to provide you with an overview of our proposed fiscal year 2015 budget and what we hope to accomplish with those resources. In discussing the IRS budget, we remain concerned about the constraints under which the IRS has been operating since 2010. Our funding for FY 2014 was set, as noted, at $11.29 billion, more than $850 million below the rate for fiscal year 2010. Important to note, the IRS is the only major federal agency operating at close to our post-sequester level rather than returning to the higher pre-sequester level as many other agencies were allowed to do. The ongoing funding shortfall has major implications for taxpayers and the tax system. This year, millions of taxpayers are finding unacceptably long wait times on the phone and at our taxpayer assistance centers to get basic questions answered and to resolve tax issues. Further, as a result of fewer staff and reduced enforcement activities, the IRS estimates it will not be able to collect billions of dollars in enforcement revenues. We estimate this year it would have returned to the federal government over $2 billion more in collections had we received the remaining $500 million cut from our budget by the sequester. The solution of the funding problem faced by the IRS begins with the administration's fiscal year 2015 budget request, which totals $12.64 billion. That's approximately $1.35 billion above the fiscal 2014 enacted level. The American taxpayer deserves to know what value they would receive for the $1.35 billion increase in funding requested for the IRS. Let me give you a few details. About $400 million would go to taxpayer service programs. We estimate this would allow us to answer an additional 12 million taxpayer calls and cause our level of phone service to exceed 80%, which would be 20 points higher than last year's level of 60.5%. The additional calls answered would include calls from those seeking help with the tax-exempt provisions of the Affordable Care Act. We would also improve phone service by, for example, making our system capable of retaining taxpayers' identifying information so they wouldn't have to repeat it after being transferred from one operator to another. Part of the funding would also go to technology investments for such things as further improvements to our website at irs.gov. Another $334 million of the total additional request would go to enforcement programs. With this funding, we estimate closing more than 500,000 additional cases, including individual audits, employment tax exams, and collection activities. We would also be able to do other things like increase our document matching program which we use to spot underreporting of income. Through these activities, we estimate we would collect an additional $2.1 billion a year in enforcement revenues. That would more than pay for the entire amount of additional funding being requested for the IRS for fiscal 2015. An important subset of enforcement is the fight against refund fraud caused by identity theft. About $65 million of the additional request would go to this area. We estimate that through improved identity theft fraud detection, we would protect an additional $360 million a year in revenue from going out the door. We would also close an additional 13,000 cases where taxpayers have been victimized by identity thieves. Another major priority for us is implementing enacted legislation. We would use $394 million of the additional request to continue implementing the Affordable Care Act and FATCA. A large portion of this is for IT upgrades. For example, we need to build new technology systems to process and analyze the reports coming to us from financial institutions under FATCA. Investments in IT are also needed to continue implementing two major ACA provisions, the premium tax credit and the individual shared responsibility provision. I want to stress that we are mandated to implement ACA and FATCA. So if we don't receive this funding, we must take it from either taxpayer service or enforcement or both. With respect to information technology, we would use another $100 million of additional requests to invest in a number of longer-term IT projects on the drawing board that are designed for such things as providing a more stable and secure computing environment and taking us to the next level of digital services for taxpayers. I want to emphasize that we take very seriously the need to be careful stewards of the funding we receive. Congress and the American public need to be confident that this money will be used wisely. It's my responsibility to ensure that that happens, and I would be delighted to report back to the committee as fiscal 2015 unfolds to discuss with you what the American taxpayer in fact received for any additional investments in our agency. That concludes my statement, and I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me start out by asking a question about spending priorities. When you were here before, we talked about the fact that how you spend the money is just as important, or almost important, or pretty close to as important as how much money you have. And I guess Mr. Serrano mentioned that 2010, you not only received a record high amount of funding, it was actually more money than the IRS had asked for. You weren't here at the time, but actually instead of hiring more revenue agents, like it said it was going to do, the IRS spent a record amount of money on travel and training. And so now we find out that you've been struggling to come up with $30 million to finish migrating to Windows, I think they call it Windows 7,
Yes.
Even though Microsoft announced in 2008 that it would stop supporting Windows XP past 2014. So I know you probably wish you'd already done that, and that's making those videos and wasting that money. That's all hindsight. But just tell the subcommittee how we can be confident that you've got the correct spending priorities, when in the past some of the excess spending or funding got spent on silly videos and things like that. So, for instance, the $30 million that's going to, I think you're going to take that from enforcement, but tell us what that means. Is that more important to the IRS than the revenue agents? If you ask for $350 million increase for enforcement next year, then part of that money is going to come out for the IT. Just talk a little about how you decide what the priorities and how you spend the money.
It's an important question that I'm delighted to answer, and as I say, keep you advised about. Wherever you think we were in 2010, we're now 10,000 fewer people, and depending how you count, $850 to $1 billion less. So whatever might have been excessive in that budget has clearly been squeezed out. At the same time, period of time over the 4 years in which the number of taxpayers has increased by somewhere in the range of 6 to 8 million, plus we have additional responsibilities provided by Congress, including implementation of the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act and ACA. So our problem right now is not around the edges. Our problem goes to the fundamental issues of what we can do. And that's one of the reasons I tried to highlight in my oral statement the priorities we have. If you think about it and step back, we have two major areas of activity. We do taxpayer services, trying to make it as easy as possible for taxpayers to figure out what they owe and to make the payments. And we have tax enforcement and collection, trying to make sure that those not willing to pay, who are actually trying to cut corners, pay their fair share, so that when you pay your taxes, you're confident that everybody is paying their fair share. So those are two sides of the same coin as far as I'm concerned, and we're understaffed in both areas. As you know, our service level is about 60% for 2013. Filing season now, it's a little above 72% because we spent a lot of time and effort answering as many calls and questions as we have. But for the year, because we don't have much more money now than we had then, we think it's going to be at 60%, which means 40% of the calls over the course of a year don't go through. There are long lines at our assistance centers, and we think, again, it's unfair to taxpayers not to provide them the level of service I think we'd all agree they deserve. On the enforcement side, we have close to 5,000 fewer revenue agents and officers than we had 4 years ago. So under this budget, we wouldn't replace all of them, but we would replace a significant number of them. In terms of our criminal investigation department, they have 350 fewer people than they had 4 years ago. They're concerned that they'll be down 500 at the rate we're going. All of that would generate significantly increased revenues. As noted, our estimate is if we had the additional revenues, the $1 billion, $2 or $3 in the budget, we'd return $2.1 billion to the government, significantly more than the amount of money we're seeking. In information technology, this year we have close to $300 million of projects on the board to improve the operations of the IRS that are not being done because of the funding shortfall. I view it as, and refer to it as, we're driving a Model T with a lot of things on top of it. We are the classic fix the airplane while you're flying it attempt. Windows 7 is part of that. You're exactly right. It's been some time where people knew Windows XP was going to disappear. The problem with Windows 7 is if we don't make that fix, which we are trying to finish up now, Windows XP will no longer be serviced. So all of the security issues that are continually updated no longer will be updated. So we are very concerned that if we don't complete that work, we're going to have an unstable environment in terms of security. So where we are significantly understaffed virtually everywhere. We're not talking about doing anything very exotic. We're not talking about making new videos. We're not talking about, last year we cut training by over 85%. Now whatever you thought about the training budget, cutting it over 80% couldn't have been the right answer. So we're going to spend more money on training, we'll spend more money on travel, but it's all going to be focused on trying to make sure that new and existing IRS employees are appropriately trained to be able to deal effectively with the taxpayers, whether they're dealing with them as taxpayer services or they're dealing with them as revenue agents and officers. So they are, for me, fairly simple, straightforward priorities, things we have to do that we want to do better than we're doing now. And at the back of all of that, behind it is we have to implement FATCA and the ACA. We have no choice about that.
Well, thank you. When you were here before, we talked about some of these issues, about how you spend the money, and one of the things that we talked about at that time was that only 60% of the telephone calls were being answered, but we also talked about the fact that you had decided to pay $63 million in bonuses that your predecessor had decided he wasn't going to do. And if you look at this year, I think the travel budget increases by $58 million. Last year it increased by $44 million. And so you have to ask the question, what is the travel more important than answering the phone call? Is it more important than upgrades in IT? Talk about those priorities.
Again, a good question. We have 90,000 employees spread across 500 offices. As Congresswoman Lori mentioned, I've now been to 20 of them and talked to over 8,000 employees. The travel we're talking about is related to both managers being able to visit and see their employees, about employees when we're not able to appropriately and effectively do training in with regard to computerized or video conferencing, actually having to travel someplace with trainers to actually gain the training as we go forward. And this is training not just for new employees, this is training to upgrade the skills of existing employees in the agency. So there's nobody going to fancy places. The last training we did was in New Carrollton, as I told somebody. It was pretty easy for me to approve it, and we have much more rigorous approval levels than we've ever had before. And so all of that is focused on trying to make sure, again, that the employees working for the agency have the right tools to be able to deal effectively with the public.
For instance, is there an increase in the money that will be used to answer the phone this time? If there's more money for travel, but is there also, he probably is. Tell us a little about that.
Yes, the level of service last year in 2013 was about 60.5%. We worked very hard. We've got a better website. We think it's going to be a little higher, but it's going to still be in the low 60s. With these funds, we would have a level of service, including an additional 11 million call demand for ACA. Our service level will go to 80%. In the halcyon old days in the mid-2000s, we were at 88%. Probably would never go above 90 because then you have people waiting for the calls. But we think we could get to 80%. That would be our goal, and we'd be willing to be held accountable to see if we couldn't do that. It would mean overall we'd answer about 12 million more calls. And I think that beyond that, we used to measure how long you had to wait on the phone in seconds. In fact, we still do it, but the seconds now are running into anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes for the calls that get through. So one of the highest priorities, as I say, if you looked at it, I've given you in this statement our priorities. One is to raise the service level from 60 to 80%. The other is to increase enforcement. We think we'll collect $2 billion more from people who are cutting corners or not paying at all, including foreign tax cheats and avoiders. And the third would be to improve our information technology system to allow us to effectively absorb the responsibilities for ACA. I would note the ACA implementation requires us to change our tax filing process. For the vast majority of Americans, they're going to check a box that says they have insurance, and they won't be affected either way by Affordable Care. But for those who have gotten premium tax credits, paid to the insurance company, not to them, we have to reconcile those because they're based on an estimate the individuals have made of what they'd actually make in 2014, just the way we all estimate how much money should be withheld. All of that has to be reconciled, all of that in the middle of the filing season. So one of the reasons I've tried to make it clear that we have no choice, if we can't implement the Affordable Care Act, it means we won't be able to run the filing season effectively. And as you know, we collect net of the $300 billion in refunds we sent out, about $2.5 trillion, so that any negative impact on the filing season dwarfs the potential loss dwarfs anything else we're talking about.
Well, thank you. And I would just, I'm happy to hear that the phone calls are a priority because, as you know, that's kind of the front door to the IRS, and that's the first contact people have, and it drives people crazy. Just in today's world, people always want to talk to like a real live person, and I appreciate the fact that you're making that a priority because I think that would go a long way toward making people feel like they're getting the response they need, and I appreciate that.
Well, one of the things, I just got an email yesterday. As I say, I've talked to over 8,000 employees now, and I've encouraged them to have information flow from the bottom up, and I have a mailbox they can send things to me. A common concern about across all those employees is just this issue, that they feel badly that they can't answer the questions and provide the service to taxpayers that they want to provide, that they think taxpayers are. And one of the email yesterday was one of the things to try to allow us to answer more calls. We've told our call center operators that they cannot answer complicated tax law questions. We have to send people to our website. We can answer straightforward, the common, how do I file, who's the head of household, standard questions. But anything at all complicated, which we up until this year answered, we can't. So this email was kind of a plea from a call center person saying, I just feel badly when I can't tell people this. Isn't there some way we could actually answer those calls because we know how to do it? And I had to write her back and say, it was a difficult choice people had to make to try to figure out how do we process as many calls as we can. And the problem with complicated questions is they take longer. So that to try to keep the call level of service up, we've had to tell people, go to our website, which is far improved over where it was a year ago, but still isn't the state-of-the-art website that we'd like to have. So again, when we go to 80%, that would include the ability for us now next year in 2015 to answer those complicated tax law questions at the same time. Because I couldn't agree with you more. The face for most taxpayers of the government and really the IRS is when they call. And if they can't get through, they're unhappy. If they can get through and then can't get an answer, they're unhappy. But the reason we have people working in call centers for 15 or 20 years, which I always thought, gee, that can't be the most fun in the world. They do it because they feel that they're providing a service. And when they can answer a question, provide help to a taxpayer, they find that very rewarding and satisfying. So I couldn't agree with you more. It's an immensely important priority for us.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking of phone calls, you may have a few when you get back to the office, because you're now quoted as saying the New Carlton is not a fancy place, and
I'm sorry about
you
that.
might be getting some from New Carlton. Let me ask you a couple of questions about restoration of services. In 2014, Congress kept the IRS at the sequester level with the addition of $92 million for certain specific purposes. How far does that go towards restoring services to the taxpayer that were reduced by the sequester? And as a follow-up, the start of the filing season was moved back 10 days due to the 16-day government shutdown. Please tell us why the shutdown had that effect, and are there other lingering effects that the shutdown had, and also the fact that we're still trying to restore services that we lost before?
I would note, even with my concerns about the underfunding, we did appreciate the $92 million of additional funding. I don't want anybody to think that that wasn't real money and that it hasn't been used well. Of it, it was designated for customer service, foreign account tax compliance implementation, and then information technology. So $34 million of it is going to customer service. To tell you the complications is the estimate it takes $6 to $8 million to improve customer service levels by 1%. So part of the reason we think the tax filing season is going so well in terms of an increased level of customer service is we are being able to spend that money, and we'll continue to spend it through this year. $39 million will go to FATCA, and the reason we haven't provided the committee with an operating plan yet for the other $19 million is we are looking at the $300 million of deferred IT projects, trying to find which 19 are going to be the highest priority, and part of it may be an additional support for the Windows 7. So it is, as I say, and we'll give you the spending plan and then show you, we're using the money very well, but there's a lot of other things that are not being done that the $92 million won't let us go for.
Right.
The shutdown obviously delayed the start of filing season, and so we didn't start until January 31st, so it compressed it a little, but thus far, I'm delighted to report the filing season has gone very smoothly. We have over 100 million returns already processed. Over 90% of them have been filed electronically. The 70% or so of those returns are getting refunds electronically that they've already gotten. So it's going very smoothly. Partially, it's going smoothly because there were no significant tax law changes for the average taxpayer. So for preparers and people filing returns, that went well. It's also going better because a lot of people go to our website now and get information there that they used to get on calls, and that's helped us maintain a very low level but still maintain it. So our hope would be that we don't do it again, because what happens in the shutdown is the entire IT department goes away for 2 weeks, 18 days, whatever the shutdown period is, and then simply can't make that up, which is why we had to delay the start this year.
Okay. You know, one thing that we've discussed here at this committee for years, and this still bothers me, is these, I don't know how else to call them, fly-by-night storefront operations that seem to continue to creep up in many communities throughout this country. And I was and hurt the taxpayer. I don't know if you read, there was a story that recently came out, maybe it was today, where a person went to get their taxes done, and they were being charged $400 for a very simple form, and they said, no, don't file that, forget it. And the person went ahead, the tax preparer went ahead and filed it anyway, and took a fee. I don't know how that happens, that you take a fee from a return or something, and the person then was caught between two different places. This seems to be an ongoing problem, and I know the IRS has dealt with it. Where are we with that, or is that one that's out of hand?
It is a concern to us. Most tax preparers are well-trained, and they do a good job. 56% of people use tax preparers, another 34% use tax preparer software. So the vast majority of them do fine. There are people who are uninformed and undertrained, and then still preparing returns. You can go, anybody in this room could go outside tomorrow morning and set up as a tax preparer. There's no requirements, no standards. As somebody has noted, we regulate and register hairdressers in every one of 50 states, and in 3 states do we register and regulate preparers. And as H&R Block had said, you would think that you'd care as much about your tax preparer as you do getting a haircut. So what happens is we have cases where we have fraudulent returns prepared by tax preparers. We have cases like the one you said where they file a return, get the refund sent to them, then they either take their fee out and give the remaining part of the refund to the taxpayer, or they keep the refund totally themselves. We have many number of cases of tax preparer fraud where the taxpayer then has to come to us and say, I had a refund coming and I've never seen it. Where did it go? We had set up in 2010 a program to provide minimum standards and certification for preparers, and the courts earlier this year ruled we had exceeded our authority to do that. So there's a hearing tomorrow in the Senate on tax preparers, and we will be supportive, I will testify and be supportive of legislation from the Congress that would give us the ability and the authority to provide and guarantee minimum standards for anybody who's going to file a tax return. And in low and middle income communities, particularly immigrant communities, people who are comfortable working in the community. So if somebody sets up shop in the community center or it's somebody's brother-in-law, a lot of returns are filed. And our concern is not only the fraud or the excessive charges to the taxpayer, but if the tax preparer doesn't know what he's doing, we can get an inaccurate return, so we then have to process back, talk to the taxpayer, trying to get just the right amount paid, which the taxpayer probably wanted to have paid to begin with.
Right. Very briefly, do you think this is something that has to be done state by state, or could be, from your viewpoint, could it be done from the federal government? I mean, I know that we want less and less government, but this is one where I think both parties could agree that it's an abuse on the people.
There are at least 3 states and other considering who regulate it locally. The tax preparer community has been supportive of a standard, national standard, so you don't end up with 50 different standards, and if you're a company operating 2 or 3 states or more, you have to then meet a whole lot of different standards. We cleared the program, it was up and running for a while, with all the constituents and all the parties, and designed this, kind of testing and the minimum standards it would be. It wouldn't be a CPA exam. It would not be that difficult. You just have to show some minimal amount of competence. And
what boundaries was it that the court said you had overstepped?
Pardon?
What was it that the court said you had done wrong?
The court said we didn't have the authority. We could require people to register and get an preparer PIN, which 600,000 preparers now have, but we couldn't require them to also take an exam, a competency exam at the same time, because there was not statutory authority for that. So we still hand out PINs, and a number of people took the test, as I noted. About 75% of them passed it. I thought the other side of the coin is that means a significant number of people couldn't pass a relatively minimum test, which is, an indication that maybe a little more education would be helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this is a very serious issue, and I think one that maybe the committee should take a closer look at. I don't know what we possibly could do from, at the federal level, and I know that the trend, and this is not a knock, is for less involvement by the federal government. But people are getting ripped off all over this country, and it makes their work harder. It makes the tax system look like a monster to a lot of people who want to pay the taxes. I mean, when you have what the commissioner just said, somebody capable of taking the refund, the full refund for themselves. I mean, I had no idea. I thought refunds went to somebody's house. That it can go to a preparer and then he or she keeps it. That's fraud at the highest level and abuse at the highest level, and maybe we should look at it as something the committee could speak on or do something about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think any kind of reasonable regulation to protect, that's what we're all about. So that's a great point. Mr. Womack?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Koskinen, welcome, and good to see you again. Funny you had mentioned hairdressers a minute ago. Every time I figure my taxes, I feel like I'm getting a haircut. So, kind of an interesting parallel there. In your testimony, you said that of the $1.4 billion increase that you'd request in 2015, that a couple of $100 million of that, 222, I think, would go to the improved taxpayer service, and you said that it would allow you to answer 12 million more calls, get you to a service level of like 80%. So can you share with the subcommittee on what metrics you used to kind of reach that? Was that just a simple math problem, or how would we actually get to the 12 million additional calls, and how many personnel are we talking about, that sort of thing?
I can get you. I asked the question myself, how do we measure the level of service, and you won't be surprised to find that it's a little complicated because you have to figure out when you hang up, does that count or not count? We actually count every call that comes in, electronically, obviously. We count which ones then don't get an answer, where people wait and then they just hang up. We count then the processing and who goes into our automated system as opposed to who gets a caller. And it's a very detailed system. We'd be happy to get you the more complicated, the way it actually works. But actually, every call that comes in gets measured. We also measure how long it takes for that call to get through. And then in our call centers, we measure how long the calls take. And we try to make sure that the call takers are efficient so they don't spend a lot of time just chatting with the taxpayer. So there's a balance of we want to give the right information, but we want to do it efficiently as we can. So it's a fully monitored system in which we are confident that we can measure exactly how many calls we're going to answer and in what order and how long it takes you to get through. So as I say, we used to be able to say you wouldn't have to wait more than 10 seconds to 20 seconds to get an answer. Now that's up into the minutes. So all of that's measured.
I think you said that the people sitting in the queue sometimes 15, 20 minutes or more.
Yes.
That was part of your testimony.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that part of the new line of questioning that you're beginning to receive is reference to the ACA. Is that
We
correct?
haven't gotten much now because it doesn't affect anybody in terms of their tax return, but we estimate that starting late in the fall into the filing season next year, as people look at the forms, as I say, most Americans are going to check a box and they're going to move on. But for those who have questions, preparers as well as people filling out their returns, our estimate is that we'll get another 11 million calls just by the number of people in the program, because a lot of people will be calling who signed up. A lot of people will be calling who don't have insurance and will want to figure out exactly how they should be responding. We will already have started this year. We will, through the summer and into the fall, put out as much information to taxpayers as we can. We are developing our website so it'll be easy for people to go, and there'll be a special section on affordable care, trying to keep as many of those calls, get the answers as easily as we can for people so they don't have to call. But inevitably, our experience is whenever there's a new provision, you get a significant number of calls asking about it.
So to kind of preempt the anticipated surge in phone calls you're going to get regarding the ACA, I'm glad you mentioned that you're going to do some things preemptively to try to push information out. What are the best management practices today in trying to reach the clientele that are trying to communicate with you? Are there any things that we've learned over the last 3 or 4 years about people and their questions and the origin of their questions or their socioeconomic status or whatever that might help us better pinpoint how we direct and leverage the limited money we have to answer a lot of those questions?
It goes across a set of communication channels, as it were, so that we have now an online services group, small but lovable, who are looking at just those questions. That is, how can we move people into the least expensive channel, get them the most information? And the least expensive channel is obviously a website, because if you come there, it's there, and other than just cost of maintaining it, it's a relatively inexpensive way to get information out. So we spent a lot of time trying to improve it. If you looked at the website a year ago and looked at it today, it's like it's a different entity. But it's still clunkier than we'd like it to be. We'd like it to be easily searchable, so anybody used to going to websites could go there and find the information. A lot of people and a lot of information goes out over things that I don't know much about, Twitter, Tumblr, YouTube. We have 100 videos on our YouTube.
Those are kind of new to me, too.
Yeah, no, that's right. So we all have the same experience about it. But there are YouTube videos telling you all sorts of information that you otherwise would be calling us about. On our website, as you know, we have a Where's My Refund app. Last year had over 200 million hits. Not 200 million taxpayers, as I tell people. Some people just can't resist pushing it and seeing each day how their refund is doing. But those are people who used to have to call. This year, for the first time, you can authenticate yourself and ask for previously filed returns. So instead of having to call us or come to our assistance centers, you can actually print out your last year's tax return, and if you need it for a mortgage or for employment or anything else, you don't have to call us about it. So what we've discovered is what is kind of axiomatic, is that younger people tend to be in social media, so as much of our outreach there goes as we can. Significant portions of the population are now used to using websites. They go to shop on websites, they do their banking on their websites. So again, we've been way behind and we need to be better at that. There will be inevitably a percentage of the population uncomfortable with all of that, who will be uncomfortable filing electronically. They are in paper generation, and they're going to stay there. And part of our commitment is we need to be able to deal with those people as well. I never want anybody to feel they've got to do something they don't know how to do or are uncomfortable with.
How many new people are we talking about?
Pardon?
Taxpayer service, how many new people?
How many new people? We're talking about as many as a couple thousand.
And then to take one of those couple of thousand people, to get them from zero to trained, what kind of a time frame are we looking at?
We have what we call seasonal employees. We're to some extent a seasonal business. We obviously are in the middle of that season right now. And so we have people who work sometimes anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 months to fill in that filing season. And we hire those people and train them, and it takes 4 to 6 weeks to get them just the basic training they're going to have. And usually the way we've streamlined it is people get trained in answering certain questions. So when you go to the phone, it'll ask you, it's like anything, you get to pick what your question is, and then that will send you to somebody who knows that area. Now, with our more experienced call center people, they can actually answer some other questions as well. So part of the challenge for us is, if I'm very good about head of households and sort of the fundamentals, and you have another question, if I haven't been trained in that, I have to say, excuse me, I have to send you to, and then there's a place where you send in somebody who's an expert in that. Done well, and that's where we'd like to get back to, you'd have people at the call centers who have a broader base of information. So when somebody calls, even though they pushed, my call is, where's my refund or something, if I have another question, I'd increase the likelihood the person on the phone could answer that question for you.
Yeah.
But for the basic training, 4 to 6 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lowy?
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to follow up with my colleague's question before, because I'd like you to get a little outraged about these scams out there, and I wonder what you're doing either in social media or signs. The storefronts open up, and innocent people come in. They don't know whether that person is legitimate or not. And then suddenly after April 15th, the storefront closes, and there are an awful lot of people who are just taking the refunds and going off. And a similar scam that I've been hearing about, which is of great concern to me, criminals are using the IRS to steal the identity of innocent taxpayers. They claim large refunds. They profit by the fraud. And the number of taxpayers affected by identity theft has more than doubled since 2011 alone. A recent Inspector General report released last year stated that billions of dollars have been fraudulently paid as a result of identity theft, and shockingly, as my understanding, that amounts to as much as $21 billion in fraudulent refunds could be paid out in the next 5 years. This is just a slap in the face to hardworking taxpayers, and I wonder what you're thinking about that. What steps has the IRS taken to halt these criminal actions? Would the budget request include adequate funds for enforcement to adequately combat this problem?
Yeah, it's a critical problem. I would start by noting that people are not stealing identities from the IRS. In other words, what's happening in refund fraud is criminals, and it's increasingly organized crime and organized syndicates, are stealing, borrowing, buying, however they get it, Social Security numbers outside the IRS. So we've never had any incident of any sort where somebody got that information from us. But they get it. Sometimes it's from death master files, sometimes it's from for kids, whatever it is. They get the Social Security number, fill out fraudulent numbers that show they're entitled to a refund, and they file it electronically and then get paid. And they're not filing one or two of these. Some of these people are filing hundreds or thousands at a time as they go. It exploded in 2010 to 2012. Overwhelmed law enforcement, overwhelmed our resources as well. We've devoted now 3,500 people who do nothing but work on this problem. We're working with state and local law enforcement, with all the financial institutions, with the Bureau of Prisons, because that's where some of it started, with people in prison. We've developed sophisticated filters that identify where the scams are coming from. Last year, we estimate keeping track of it, that we stopped just a little less than $18 billion in fraudulent refunds from going out the door. But of course, and in the IG report, we're all trying to figure out what does that mean in terms of you don't know what you don't know, how much is going out. And we have done audits and we're doing algorithms to protect on that. Part of the additional funding here would allow us to upgrade our IT because right now our filters can only be adjusted in between filing season. This Model T does not allow us on the run to adjust the filters. Some portion of the IT money here would go to what we call the return review program, which would allow us, as we see scams, to adjust immediately. We also are taking a hard look at, and one of our legislative proposals is to move the filing of W-2s to the IRS up to the end of January, the way it is for employees. We don't get the W-2s, they go through Social Security, we don't get them until the middle of March. So as I've told people, we've gotten to be too efficient. In the old days, when I was younger, you sent a check, it took for a while to get it deposited, and it took months before you got your refund. Now we tell you that you file electronically or on paper, we'll get you a refund in 21 days. But the problem is we've leapfrogged the third-party information. So across the board, and then the final piece is we've ramped up from 2012 to 2013 by multiples of 4 and 5 the number of investigations, indictments, prosecutions, and convictions. Last year we recommended over 1,000 prosecutions. We had 400 people sent to jail for a long time. These are not 6-month sentences. We now have, I just met Friday with the U.S. attorneys for Indiana and Northern Illinois about our cooperative efforts prosecuting refund fraud and other cases. And we've got partnerships across the country. So it's a significant problem. If you ask me what are the 4 or 5 things we focus most on, refund fraud and identity theft is one of them.
Do you have adequate resources in order to do what you have to do?
Well, as I said, right now we have this mechanical, clunky system that doesn't allow us to respond on the spot. A significant part, 65 million or more of the IT, would allow us to, in fact, become quicker on our feet. If we don't become quicker on our feet, we'll still get better because the filters are very sophisticated. We just can't adjust them, and part of what's happening is people are reverse engineering. You know, you file 1,000 fraudulent returns, and then you can see which ones go through, and you can pretty much try to figure out, okay, what we're looking at, and then you adjust on the run. They can adjust faster than we can adjust.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do hope that we will give you the resources so you can continue to pursue these crooks out there, and I thank you very much for your attention to it.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. And I think somewhere I read that some address, like in Atlanta, Georgia, got like 2,000 refunds. Somebody stole different identities, listed the address in Atlanta. Is that close to truth?
There are first, A, it's true. B, there are some places where refunds legitimately go. Some preparers get the refunds there, some retirement communities. There are groups of people who file and it all goes to a single address. But one of the issues of being a little slow in responding is as we go forward, we think we've got a way to stop that. You know, part of it's all mechanical. I went to just Detroit Thursday and we send out 200 million notices a year to people. And I watched the computer program. I'm just like an assembly on this big set of machines that have to crank out those notices and file them. So all of this stuff is, you process 150 million tax returns as we will this year. I mean, it's a stunning number when you try to figure out what's that look like. So part of the reason and the way we were able to process refunds so quickly is they're processed automatically. So you have to build in the filters that say, well, it makes no sense to send a whole lot of, refunds to that bank. We're working with banks banks are stopping refund fraud when they see it and sending us the money back. But it's like the old whack-a-mole. You knock them down here and it comes up over there. But one of the big issues you look at it and say, well, if there are more than 10 refunds going there, it's got to be some issue worth looking into.
Yeah, and the point being, we all know it takes money to do these things, but more money is not the only answer to all the problems in the world.
Exactly right.
And I appreciate the fact that you're trying to kind of figure out process efficiencies, all those kind of things, because try to stay ahead of the bad guys.
Right.
Mr. I
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, good to see you again. I I know your statement references your preparation for how the department will begin handling the healthcare law implications within your arena. And I guess we're about 53 weeks away from the individual side beginning.
Actually, less of that. The individual side has to be up and running at the start of filing season, so it'll be January.
Okay. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that, some of your preparations? And I know that you indicate in your comments here that a lot is underway, and maybe bring some clarity to how there might be how the verification process works, whether individuals in fact do have the appropriate health care coverage that is demanded under the law, how the penalties will be assessed, or I guess you refer to them now as the individual shared responsibility provision. Is that only through a refund, or is that outside of a refund? Is there some other mechanism that occurs? And then when you're finished with that, I'd maybe clarity on the differences between individuals and then small business owners who are currently filing this year for 14's taxes as well. So a couple of different things there, but to bring clarity, and I'll be happy to follow up.
I'll do my best to do that. It's, as you can understand, a multifaceted issue. On the front end, in terms of just how the program runs, and we're talking about refund fraud that we're talking about there, what are the fraudulent? Let's say for the vast majority of Americans, they've got insurance, they've got Medicare, whatever it is, so this is all going to be beyond them. It won't be affected by it. If you apply for an advance premium tax credit, the money doesn't go to you, it goes to the insurance company you're buying the policy with. So at the front end, there's less incentive for people to fraudulently try to claim the money because it doesn't go to them, unless you've got an uncle at Blue Cross you'd like to get a bigger premium. So everybody's making an estimate as to what they're going to earn this year to figure out what premium credit they're entitled to, and that's going to the insurance companies. In filing season next year, when those people file, they're going to actually know how much they made, and they're going to have to reconcile, and they'll either owe us money or we'll owe them money. Some people could not get the credit during the year in advance and would apply and say, okay, I bought this insurance policy, here's my income, I now get a refund. That would go directly to them, but it only goes to them if the insurance company, which is sending us all this data, verifies that you actually had a policy. So you can't get a credit independent of the policy. Now the processing of all that is, as I say, is just in the middle of filing.
So you'll receive information from the insurance company.
So we're going to get information starting through
begin
the year,
pairing that together.
and we're going to be able to verify. It's like getting W-2 information. Third-party information will verify that you had a policy, so that the chances of your figuring out how to get money beyond what you're entitled to are slim in that case as we go. So the problem for us, the challenge, IT challenge, is that all of this has to be built into our normal computerized filing system. So there are something like over 50 systems that have to be adjusted to take into account these calculations. Then getting to the question about, okay, now what do we do about enforcement? If you got too much credit, you'll owe us the money and we'll take it out of your refund, or you'll pay it as a tax due. If you got too little, we'll add it to your return as a refund or subtract it from the amount you owe as you go forward. The question will be, okay, I didn't buy. I was supposed to buy insurance. I didn't buy it. I have the responsibility payment penalty, however you'd call it, of $95 or 1%. The statute limits our ability to collect on that. We can deduct it from a refund, so if you owe us $95 and otherwise would have gotten a $500 refund, we'll subtract it. But if you owe taxes and pay taxes, but you don't pay the $95 and we assess it, we can't levy against you. We can't do the usual enforcement. We can write you a letter and say, hey, you owe us the money, and next year take it out of a refund. But we have limited enforcement ability against you, which is easy to understand, but that's another complication for our filing return, because then we have to be able to identify that what you owe us is tied to the responsibility payment, not normal taxes, because if it's normal taxes, you go into our normal collection and enforcement process. So we have to have a computer system. The penalty system goes into a more modified collection process. So the computer system has to recognize all that and be able to say, all right, you owe us $95, but that's what you owed us because you earned and didn't pay enough in withholding, or you owe us $95 and that's because you didn't buy an insurance policy, and now we're actually going to collect from you in a different, more modified way than before. So that
Could I ask another question on
Sure.
that? So if you have unpaid taxes, there's penalties and interest
Right.
that date back to the time the taxes were due. Is that the same with the
Yeah, my understanding
Supreme
is
Court
if
ruled
you owe-
that-
if you
that
owe the
the-
money, you owe the money. We
Right.
just, there are limits
Right.
to what we can do to chase you for it.
Okay, so are there penalties and interest if somebody doesn't pay their $95?
Yes, my understanding, although that's the first time anybody's asked that specific question, so I will double check to make sure I'm right, but my
And
understanding.
the reason I ask is because the Supreme Court, I thought, ruled this a tax.
Yes.
And you continue to use, and everybody does, I guess, the individual shared responsibility provision. And so I'm curious if it's being treated the same as a
Yeah,
tax.
it is, as I say, it's partially because we can collect from you in the way we normally do, short of filing a levy or chasing you. And that's my understanding is that it's money you owe us, we'll take it out of next year's refund, and there are penalty and interest applied.
Okay. And if I could ask one more, Mr. Chairman. And then as far as small business owners who are filing quarterly currently, are they required to begin that process now, seeing how they are paying their quarterly taxes today? Because I think there's been some dispute as to whether or not they wait to
the end of the
till the end of the year, to the 2015 filing backwards, but because they pay quarterly now, as small business owners, as individuals or sole proprietors, I assume.
That I don't know the answer to, but I will get back to you very quickly because that's a straightforward, simple question, and I'll get back to you in the next few days.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder just walked in. He's collecting his thoughts. So let's.
Yeah, he and I are suffering from the NCAA tournament together, so.
Well, I hope you didn't have anything to do with Duke losing to Mercer, because I think that knocked out about 99% of all the
They've
people
both had
trying to
plenty of
win
time
$1
to
billion.
recover.
Nothing. But I don't think anybody other than you, Mr. Graves, picked Mercer to beat Duke. So there are a lot of unhappy people. That's why you're here. Okay, well, let me ask a quick question. I mentioned in my opening statement that we had the omnibus bill last year that was bipartisan, and we put language in there that said you can't use the funds to target certain groups. We said you can't use money from the funding to target certain citizens for rights guaranteed under the First Amendment. We said that we were going to require videos that were produced by you all to be subject to appropriate review. And so my question is, why didn't your budget request include those three prohibitions?
Because for years going, OMB, whoever the administration was, has always opposed riders on appropriation bills, whatever they say. So this was a decision made by the administration and OMB to, again, continue to oppose any riders. I would note that as far as I'm concerned, as you know, I think taxpayers have a right to expect to be treated fairly, not only under the constitutional rights, but they need to understand that no matter who they are, whatever organization they belong to, whoever they voted for in the last election, when they deal with the IRS in any way, they need to feel they're going to be treated the same way everybody else is. If we contact you, it's because we got a question about something in your return, and that's the only reason you're going to hear from us. And if somebody else had that same issue in their return, they'd hear from us in the same way. So my sense is we don't need a rider. We're happy, if you want to put another one in, that's fine. But I don't think we ought to need a rider, and we certainly don't as long as I'm there, to say people ought to be treated fairly. They ought not to be singled out because of anything other than whatever they are filing with the IRS. And so my strong view.
So you don't plan on doing those activities this year?
No.
And you wouldn't have any problem if we were to prohibit those activities in this year's bill?
As I say, we don't. I know, having been at OMB 20 years ago, although I was on the management side, I know, and even when I was in the city, anytime riders are put into appropriations bill, the recipients always say you ought to do that separate from it, and so they'll continue. It will always be that dialogue and response back. But as I say, we're not going to do it anyway. Whether you get to add the rider or leave it out or change the language, and it's not going to affect the way we behave.
That's good to hear. I do think sometimes riders make their way into requests, but that's not your call to make, and I appreciate that. But I think that there are probably some things that in the request the administration made this year, so whoever makes that decision is not always absolutely consistent. But again, that's above your pay grade.
Right.
Let me ask you, about the 501c4 regulations. We talked a little bit about this when you were here before us. And as you know, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Rogers, and some other the House leaders wrote a letter to ask you to withdraw the draft of the 501c4, which I'd probably agree with, but I don't think you agree with that. And as far as I know, that you continue to move ahead. We talked about the fact that the number of comments grows almost daily. Last report I had was the 150,000 comments. Are we getting higher than that now?
Well, the last estimate I had from Treasury, which keeps track of these, although I don't know who counts them, but anyway, is that it's just above 150,000.
Gotcha. As a kind of a perspective, I understand the XL pipeline, which is pretty controversial, had about 7,000 comments, and so evidently there are a lot of people that are interested in this regulation. And so you talked before that maybe something that controversial, you might republish the rule and ask for even additional comments. Can you give us an update on what your plans are?
As I would say, as you know, this draft proposal was put out actually convenient 2 weeks before my confirmation hearing, just to make it more interesting to have a confirmation hearing. So I don't know how it came about and what they did with it. As you know, my view, and I've said that publicly on numerous occasions, is that I do think clarity would help. While I don't control the process, I do think that any regulation that comes out finally ought to be fair to everybody, ought to be clear, and ought to be easily administratable. In light of the comments, which are voluminous, there will be a public hearing at which people in the public as well as the Congress can testify. They'll have to figure out a way to screen everybody, otherwise, you know, we could be there for weeks. There will be a public hearing. In light of the comments, a lot of them, I haven't seen them, but I know that some of them are long and thoughtful, and I assume a number of them will be. I think there's a reasonable possibility you'll have to redraft a proposal which would go out again for public comment. So as I have said, I think the chances, I originally said when we had about 25,000 comments that I thought the chances of getting a final regulation through the process before the end of the year were slim. We had 150,000 comments, you know, all of which we have an obligation to consider. I think that it'll be the end of the year probably before we get to it. But I do think that moving from a, quote, facts and circumstances test, which doesn't give people running the organization any more clarity than it does IRS people trying to figure out whether they apply or not. If you had, as I say, a regulation that was fair to everybody, so it didn't discriminate one group against another, it didn't encourage you to sort of form yourself one way or the other, it was just a fair, straightforward, clear, and easy to administer set of rules, that you would then make it a lot easier for people running these organizations to feel comfortable that they know what to do and they can do every day and they're not risking their exemption. And that, again, wherever they are on the political spectrum, they're all in the same boat.
Well, you know, there's a lot of concern when it was first published that whether it was going to happen before this year's election cycle was on the tip of everyone's tongue. And from your testimony, it sounds like it won't happen before the end of this year, which won't happen before the elections in November. Is that still your best judgment?
That's my best judgment.
Tell us, and this has to do with priorities, but how much staff time have you at the IRS spent on preparing the regulation and reviewing the comments? Because that gets into where your priorities are. But have you got an idea of how much time and energy and money has been spent on promulgating this and then reviewing this?
I don't. As I say, the promulgation was all done and the discussions were before late November when it was issued. We're in the process now. A lot of the comments are electronic. You know, you go to the website and it'll tell you how many they've counted on the electronic side, and then we got paper ones to boot. And so we're at the front end of that process of segregating them into, you know, who's in favor of what. There are three big questions. One is, what's the definition of political activity? The second is, to which organizations should it apply across the 501c3, 4, 5, 6, 7s? And what's the amount of activity that you can engage in without jeopardizing whatever your qualification is? The regulation only proposed a definition of political activity. It left open and asked for comments on the other two questions. So we have to bucket, as it were, probably a better verb than that, but anyway, take these comments, put them into processes so we can actually know. Some of them will be repetitive, across the board, so okay, there are 5,000 that say this. They're going to have some, as I say, I know I've seen a couple that are very thoughtful, like 5-page intellectual analyses of what you'd count, what the impact would be. One of the questions is, what's the impact on somebody who's a 501c3 or a 501c5? I mean, there are 1,600,000 tax-exempt organizations out there, and part of the reason for asking for comments was nobody knows exactly what all of them are doing. Garden clubs, obviously, one would think would not be involved. So at this point, I can get you an estimate, but the time that's going to take is really going forward, which is to try to work through all of those comments, then take them into consideration, have a public hearing, get that there, and then figure out what's an appropriate response to both the public hearing, all of the debate that's gone on, but in particular, an appropriate response to the comments, because, as I say, the purpose of them is you should read them and listen to them and benefit from them.
Well, my only point is that obviously costs something. And in terms of when you figure out your limited resources, you got to make those judgments. To try to do a rule like this fast would probably cost more money, devoting more people, early on, as opposed to doing it in maybe a more thoughtful way that might take a little more time, but also might not. It might let you spread out the expense over all the staff, and so.
Well, that's the way we're going. I mean, there is no rush to judgment on this to say we got to get it out. And in fact, as you know, I think it, just personally, not the guy who controls it all, but the goal here is not to end up, sort of rushing to see if we can get it out in October or something, which would seem to me
You still got to answer the phone along the way, right?
That's right. So we've got to answer the phone. So I do think you're right, that we ought to address it in an appropriate, thoughtful way, and because I want people to feel comfortable when we come out with whatever we're coming out with, that it wasn't something that we just went through the motions with, that we actually listened to and read those and heard what the comments were and the concerns were across all three questions about the definition of the political activity, to whom it ought to apply, and how much of it you could do without jeopardizing your exemption.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on that, you have released proposed regulations intended to provide clarity to the standards for determining the tax-exempt status of 501c4 organizations. I understand that you've received over 150,000 comments and that public hearings will start soon on the proposed regulations. Why did the IRS issue these proposed regulations?
Why?
Why?
I wasn't around, so I can't tell you why, other than all I can tell you is that from my standpoint, as kind of the new guy on the block, I think having a standard that says facts and circumstances is difficult to administer, difficult for people running an organization to understand on a rolling basis how it runs, how to measure how much of it is. So just from outside the ongoing debate, it does seem to me if we came up with a, as I say, fair to everybody, clear, easily administered rule, everybody would benefit. So I think it's worth the effort. But what was going on when people decided to promulgate it? It was a recommendation of the Inspector General.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. My understanding was...
One of his 9 recommendations was the IRS and Treasury ought to put onto their priority plan clarity. And so I'm sure that was the major driver last fall.
Well, that's what I understood, that it was a recommendation of the IG, and while some may differ in a respectful way on how much time you spend on regulations, I think this particular one has caused enough heartache in this country, this whole issue, that we need to clarify clearly what is allowed, what is not allowed, as much as we can, so that people have guidance and so that we can stop talking about it as much as we talk about it, too.
Well, again, I would hope the public would feel comfortable that in light of the volume of the comments, but also that they come from everywhere. So we've managed to generate interest, across the entire political spectrum, across a lot of different organizations, so that it's a broader, which I think is appropriate now, review and discussion than it might have been viewed perhaps in the past. And so I hope people would understand that everybody's going to be heard, and that ultimately, while we may not satisfy exactly everybody, I think if it's a fair result and balanced and deals with everybody fairly, most people would, I think, be comfortable with it and think it is an improvement.
Right. Let me ask you something about an issue that we deal with all the time, but sometimes doesn't get the attention it should. The tax gap was last updated in 2006. Will the IRS be updating this statistic, and if so, when will you do so? And please talk about your efforts to address it, and which can cost taxpayers, or is costing taxpayers $450 billion a year right now.
Right. Actually, the tax gap was updated in either 2011 or 12, but it's on the basis of 2006 data.
I see.
And the problem is it's a long, complicated process, so you're always out of sync and out of check with it. It's so I've asked that question to see when is it meaningful, because the tax gap number didn't change significantly between the earlier update. When is it meaning for us, again, and the resources we have to undertake the research project it takes? It's a long analysis. You have to worry about taking into consideration all the information you get from audits. You do some additional audits to try to test, where the compliant taxpayers are, how many other people are out there who should look like them. One of the big improvements in attacking the tax gap is thanks to legislation passed by the Congress, which requires credit card companies to file what's called a 1099-K with anybody who gets, has clients who use a credit card, right, as well as with the IRS. So for the first time, we'll have third-party information about what's going on in a big chunk of the economy. And the estimate has been about a third of the tax gap is in that area. That is that everybody from gas station owners to mid-sized companies who basically have been operating without knowing that we don't have any independent way other than auditing them and going through their books and records to know exactly how much they had in revenues and what their expenses were. And our experience is that compliance goes up significantly when people know you got the data. So we're a tax compliant nation. I think we deserve great credit for that. But part of it is because everybody knows we got your W-2, we get you sooner or later, we're going to get your 1099, and so it's, now with FATCA, we're going to find out who's got assets in the Cayman Islands and in Switzerland.
Right.
So that my guess is compliance is going to go up a lot voluntarily abroad as well. So I think we're going to make inroads in the tax gap, so it may actually make more sense a year or two from now as we've begun to complete our pilots about how to use this information, how to deal with small and medium-sized businesses to see what difference it makes, because we know kind of where we were. There's no indication that the gap has changed significantly from basically its goal. It was about $425 billion, less about $50 billion that we collect. A lot of the collections are part of the tax gap, obviously, because those are people who weren't paying or didn't want to pay. So at about 375 was the net, and as I say, about 135 billion of that was the estimate is in this area we're now able to deal with thanks to the support we've gotten from Congress.
Do I have time for one more question?
Quick one.
Sure. When you're in this room, for sure, you're on TV. I don't know if you're aware of this. The big room gets seen by the public, and they're hearing the word Bitcoin. Could you tell us from an IRS perspective, what is a Bitcoin? Why did you decide to tax it as property, and how challenging will that be in going through the returns and finding out the information you need?
I feel like Congressman Womack here. He and I are looking at Bitcoin just about the same way we're looking at some of the social media issues. Bitcoin is a fascinating kind of intellectual challenge. The question is, what's currency? In the old days, really old, thousands of years ago, currency was whatever you bartered. Salt was a very valuable commodity. People used salt as a currency. The Romans had old coins. And so the question is, how does currency function? And particularly here, how does currency function when it's not issued by a government? It doesn't have anything behind it other than the transaction nature. So I think we're at the beginning of the discussion about what Bitcoin is and how it's going to work, or what online non-governmental currencies are. The position that the IRS Treasury regulation took was, at this point, it's not a currency in the way we think of currency, because it's not supported by any visible means of support, and therefore it's a commodity. And when you trade it, you can't pay your taxes with it, but we recognize people are in commerce trading it back and forth. And what it says is you have to treat it as property, and that is if you're making a profit or a loss as you trade the Bitcoin and buy something with it, you have to keep track of that, which will be complicated, needless to say. But it's not that different. Normally if you go to Europe and you buy euros and they go up or down in value, you don't pay any attention to that. You just use the euro. And, you're in effect making or losing money, but you're not keeping much track of it. Currency traders, there are people who trade currencies, and they treat them then as property. They're making money on the change in the value. So, in effect, everybody who's in the Bitcoin business is as if they were a currency trader in Bitcoin, and it's property. So you have to keep track of it. Now, in the paper I read, there are people saying, well, they're going to figure out ways to make it easy for you to figure out how much did you pay for your Bitcoins, and when you held them for a while and used them, did you make money or lose on them? As it is now, you kind of, like a stock, you have to keep track yourself. In the old days, that's what everybody had to do. You bought the stock, and then if it went up or down, you had to keep track yourself as to what its value change was. So on the one hand, the IRS Treasury regulation accepts or validates that Bitcoins are out there and people are using them. They're enough real about them that, in fact, the IRS would say they are property. But it is an understandable position for the experts on this, of which I am not one, to take the position, but it's not a currency at this stage. Now, at some point in the evolution of time, will it become a currency? Will it be traded or treated or supported as such? Who knows? But as I say, I think we're at the front end of Bitcoins. And, the issue recently about whether you could suddenly lose track of where they are. They're electronic. And so when the, whatever it was, Cox or Olive, whoever the company was that went under, when you suddenly had hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoins disappear, gave you some idea that, well, this isn't your normal currency. And so I think at this stage, the advice given by the Treasury and IRS was an attempt to start moving down the path of dealing with these currencies and transactions as they unfold.
Well, I thank you.
Just,
if it doesn't make noise in your pocket, it's going to be hard for us to...
Well, I'll let you know, Mr. Strong, without divulging, I don't know what the IRS implications might be, but as you look into the future, if you want to go take a ride in outer space, there are people that will allow you to pay for that with Bitcoin. So just keep that in mind as we look to the future. Now I'll recognize
Is that what you're trying to say?
Why would Serrano want to pay large Bitcoins to go to outer space when he's already been there a few times? I mean, I'm just, as a joke.
No, I did. On a Saturday night, and it was full of Republicans.
Yeah, I hear you. Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Yoder was next.
If he's gathered his thoughts,
he's had plenty of time.
He didn't give me a signal, but
I've had more than enough time. Thank you, Mr.
great.
Chairman.
Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, welcome back to the committee. I want to thank you for something. After the University of Kansas lost their second round basketball game in the NCAA tournament, it took a while for me to be able to even speak of that awful moment. But knowing that Duke had lost already really made it a lot easier for me to be able to get through my day. So I just want to thank Duke for losing and North Carolina for losing as well. And
once your team loses,
yeah.
you root for everybody else
right.
to lose.
That's right.
You become a great supporter of Dayton.
Remember, the overall chairman's team is playing tonight, so just...
Yeah, well, and that's a problem for me as well because my wife's a Kentucky grad, so we'll just move on to other topics. But I want to ask you a question on a few different topics. I want to start with the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. I understand the Treasury and the IRS have recently issued forms and rules to help alleviate problems financial institutions are facing in complying with this new act. However, the act is scheduled to be in effect starting July 1 of this year, but existing law in some countries makes it impossible for some financial institutions to comply without an intergovernmental agreement, an IGA, in place to resolve those legal issues. It is my understanding that fewer than 30 intergovernmental agreements have been signed by the U.S., and fewer than 30 IGAs have been tentatively agreed to. That unfortunately leaves many dozens of countries that have not reached agreement with the U.S. on how their financial institutions can comply with the FATCA. So I have a few questions for you. One, what guidance can you provide to global financial institutions that are trying to comply but cannot because the U.S. has not reached the necessary agreements with many countries on compliance with FATCA? Secondly, would the IRS take the view that the inability to comply in one of many countries in which they do business might affect the treatment of the entire organization? In other words, should the fact that the U.S. has not reached agreement with India, for example, mean that the entire foreign financial institution cannot be in compliance with FATCA, even though it is in fact in compliance for all of its operations in countries where the U.S. has negotiated the necessary agreements? And then lastly on this topic, would you be prepared to offer accommodations to financial institutions that are as compliant as they can be under the current law, given the complexities of achieving the necessary cooperation of international taxing authorities?
Well, let me work in reverse and
Sure.
note that as much like the C4 regulations, I don't control the guidance process. It's a joint effort, and ultimately Treasury is responsible for those things, and Treasury is responsible for tax policy as it relates to that. We are fondly reviewed as tax administrators, tax collectors. So the answers to those, most of your questions, which are very important questions for obviously the financial institutions involved, really are going to come out of the Treasury Tax Policy Group. But at this point, the good news is that Treasury has announced that, I think they've announced anyway, my understanding is that if you've initialed the agreement and it's just waiting for final adoption, that will count. So that we are getting close to 50 countries that either have a signed agreement or basically a negotiated agreement that's been initialed by both parties and is now just moving toward a conclusion. So 50 is a good number in the sense it covers a lot of the countries that everybody's been focused on as we go. But it does raise, and there's a lot of other countries, another 100, 125 easily. It does raise the questions you raised. In particular, the one that I had not heard people discuss yet, but it does seem to me appropriate, is if I'm in this global economy, any number of financial institutions are operating in a number of different countries, so that to the extent that, the good question is, if I'm in 30 countries, 20 of which have agreements and 10 don't, do I at least get credit for the 20 I'm in that have agreements? And again, that's a question the Treasury would have to answer, but it does seem to me logically that you ought to be, if you're operating and your accounts are in a country that are compliant, that ought to count for something. But the problem is the penalty is withholding payments made on accounts you have here. So it's going to be a more complicated answer than the logic of, well, you ought to get some credit because you ought to for that. So I will be happy to find out from Treasury where they are and whether anybody's asked that question. I know they are working, and most of the countries are working very hard to get to the international agreements. Some of the, so we have 50. A lot of the other countries, in effect, have rules that allow the banks to provide the information directly. It was only some of the countries that had bank secrecy laws, which were part of what was their attraction for people as a place to have accounts, that then discovered they were suddenly stuck in that message. But a lot of countries basically will allow their banks to provide that information. So it's the real question is between 50 and 180 or whatever the number of countries are, how many of them are have bank secrecy laws and no agreement? And that I don't know the answer to.
Well, your efforts to clarify some of these things will be helpful. I'm sure you can imagine there's a lot of confusion going up. July 1's coming quickly, and there's just uncertainty. Our office gets questions, and so I pass those questions along to you, and to the extent you can help us clarify, great, and we appreciate your efforts in that regard. Shifting gears for a minute, I want to talk a little about the Earned Income Tax Credit. And I had some tax preparers in my office recently, and we were talking about just the amount of fraud that goes on in this program. I know you're probably well aware of it. It's pretty stunning numbers that when you look at a program that has had upwards of 25 to 30% of the payments fraudulent. I think reports now are 21 to 25% of the earned income tax payments are fraudulent payments that go to folks that are not entitled or eligible for those benefits. And correct me if you have better, more accurate numbers in a moment here. What tools do you need to fix this problem? We're talking 10 to maybe 13, 14 billion dollars in lost revenue or money that's going out basically from the federal treasury to folks that don't deserve those dollars. That's a lot of money, particularly when we're talking about trying to find money for Head Start and cancer research and things that could really help people or reduce the tax burden for Americans that are already struggling in this economy. How do we root out that fraud, number one? And then two, the taxpayer suggested to me that there's a little bit of a loophole in that when they help someone prepare an earned income tax application, they have to certify a list of questions that they're on the line for determining were accurately responded to, or at least that they asked the questions and sought answers. And they've had people, when they've asked the questions, say, never mind, I'm just going to file it myself. That way I don't have to actually answer those questions. And they describe an online loophole that allows people to basically not have to attest to all the same things they might have to attest to with the preparer. What do you know about that? What, is that accurate, and what can we do to fix that problem as well?
Right. It is, as I talk with employees, and I tell them that even with our constrained resources, there are a set of things we need to address, and they're what I call the visible issues. So we need to make sure filing season, which is the most visible, goes well, as it has this year, and the challenge for implementing Affordable Care Act and FATCA next year is make sure that it goes well because it ties right directly into the filing season. And so we're going to do that, and I'm committed to that. In terms of other issues, we need to get the C4 issue behind us. We're providing voluminous documents to the 6 investigative groups. Not a resource issue. It's just, can we ever get the document production completed and somebody issues a report? Because I said once we have the report, we'll take the facts, whatever they are, do whatever in addition to the things we've already done, and then we'll move on. We need to do that. We need to deal. We have a C3 backlog that requires us. We're redoing the way small PTAs, as I call them, get processed. There's no reason they should get the same 31-page application that somebody's going to spend $2 million with. And those are all visible, and those are things we need to deal with. And I think we have a program, and we're in good shape for that. We have a good story, as I just talked about a huge problem of refund fraud, where we've got programs going. We're making a dent in it. I think we're going to, with a little bit more funding, we'll actually make a bigger dent. The area where the last area that is visible, where I don't think we have had a good story, is in fact the Earned Income Tax Credit. As you know, the improper payment rate has been 20 to 22%, and the amount of money improperly going out is 12 to 14 billion, and it's been that way for several years. And it's not that the IRS hasn't tried a lot of things; they've tried a lot of different things, and it seems to have made no difference. So I have told people that's an untenable position to be in. We need to let people know that we know it's a problem, and we recognize that. We think it's important to solve the problem, and we think that, in fact, there ought to be a way to deal with it. So I've had 2 long meetings with anybody who ever thought about this problem in the IRS to say, okay, don't tell me what we've done. That's fine. It didn't work. We can't keep doing it expecting it to be different. What are the changes we need? And so your question is my question. And there are several things. One is we've disaggregated, where does the improper payment come from? It's not, some of it's fraud by refund preparers who take the money and run off. Some of it's improper payment definitionally. The statute's very complicated about where the children are. There's relatively little fraud in the single taxpayer with no children. The maximum payment there is about $600, so it's not a huge incentive to cheat. And the fraud there is just the understatement of income to try to make yourself qualified, and we have the usual ways of tracking that. The real problem is the complexity around dependents. And how many children do you have, and where are they, and are they with you? Are they with your wife if you're divorced? Are they with somebody's grandmother? How many different people are claiming them? And that's where the attestation comes in, and people have to certify, okay, I've got this many children, and this is where they are. So we spend a lot of time auditing these people, but it's clear we're not going to audit our way out of the problem. We've dealt with tax preparers because of, over 50%, 57 at one point, over 60% of the returns were filed by preparers, and so they were a group we could educate about the problem. We could ask for their assistance to make sure that they're comfortable that they're filing. And your report is right. Some people have said, well, in that case, I won't go to the preparer. I'll just do it myself. And so part of it goes to our goal of providing minimum standards and regulating preparers. But part of it is there are legislative things that would help us. 2 of them are, one is what's called correctable error authority, which would allow us, if we see beyond just math errors, if we see an error in a return, and we see them in, particularly in this area where we have information that says we don't think you got the right number of children here, we can't adjust that refund without actually auditing you. We don't have the authority to adjust it. Now, if we adjusted it and had that authority, we'd tell you that we adjusted it. You would still have the normal rights to appeal or complain or explain. But we haven't got enough resources, and it wouldn't make sense for us in all of those returns where we see there's a problem to then go out and try to audit. We do 500,000 audits in this area already. It's about a third of the audits we do. So if we had correctable error authority, it would be a big step forward. The other thing we're asking for authority on is to move the W-2 filings to the IRS by the end of January. We would collect some of the understatement of income from people. It would allow us to make sure that the fraudulent filers are out of there. The problem is a lot of EITC filers don't have W-2s. They, make money and they file Schedule Cs. They're, gardeners. They're working in assistance places where they don't get W-2s as we go forward. The third piece of it we're looking at is where we can get additional third-party information, particularly about children. We have some of that in our dependent database. We need to make that improved and better. And then the fourth, and we haven't gotten that far yet, is whether there's a way to simplify the statute. Statute, I got to tell you, I've read it, read the requirements, and even I have trouble figuring out what some of the rules are. You can't be filing a return above a certain age if you're already on somebody else's return, or you're older than the taxpayer who's filing it. I mean, you look at it and think, now, what kind of situation is that? And so I understand how these things grow, but one of the things I've asked for, and we don't have it in our legislative proposal yet, is there a way to make the statute simpler so that people trying to make the right decision and make the right filing would be able to do it without a lot of complications? But I do think it's an important problem, and as I've told our employees, we have to have a better story. And it's not a better story to talk about. We have to have a better story of beginning to make a dent in the improper payment rate and in the amount of money that's being paid out.
If I might just on this topic follow up, Mr. Chairman, that yield back. Is it accurate that they don't have to, these applicants don't have to attest the same information that they might have to attest through a preparer? Wouldn't that be something we could clean up very easily?
One of the issues, and that's one of the questions, some of these things we can do on our own, some we need legislation for, and one of the questions we're looking at is, everybody's sensitive appropriately to the burden we place on individual taxpayers.
Absolutely.
And so we don't want to gratuitously suddenly make a group of people do more. But on the other hand, my view has been, this is an important program. I remember when it was passed. It supports working poor. It gives people incentives to work. It's a great program, and it turns over. Part of the problem is a third of the eligible people turn over every year. They get a better job. Something changes in their circumstances. So we have this irony is we have to be out trying to make sure people eligible sign up. An odd thing for tax collectors who are doing. But back to your point.
Yeah, just on that specific
point. On that point, my view is I'm sensitive to burden. We have to be careful about it. But on the other hand, we can't live with these numbers. And so if it means that there's going to be it's a little more burdensome to file, and if it means the refund maybe comes a couple weeks later so we can actually process third-party information, we need to take a hard look at doing that.
I just think when a program's got 20, 22, and it's been up to maybe, I've read 25 or 30% over the years in fraud.
It's always been 20. Somehow magically 20 to 22 is the number.
Yeah,
Not to 30. But,
either way, that's a stunning amount of fraud. Yes, and I would think something as simple as you have to attest to certain facts before you're eligible, the same facts you'd have to attest to through a preparer when you fill out your form, to me seems a minimal burden to root out what is essentially a fraud that cheats and hurts every other tax-paying American who isn't cheating the system.
I think we have to look at it. I would simply state that not all of it's fraud. It's improper payments to a lot of extent. It's not necessarily people consciously trying to do it. It's in fact that it is complicated to figure out.
If we simplify the tax code, then we don't need to spend as much money on the IRS.
Back to FATCA for just a moment.
Mr. Womack.
Real quickly, what's the amount of money that the Treasury is losing to offshore tax noncompliance?
I'm not sure anybody knows the answer to that. It's one of those unknowns.
What do you think it is?
We don't know what we know. We do know that the volunteer disclosure program has flushed out 43,000 people who have paid about $6 billion already, and obviously some of the more hardcore people are still hanging out there, figuring maybe we won't get to their country or their assets. But I've never seen an estimate as to what's out there. My concern about it has been, or my view of why it's important, is it's important to have collected the $5 or $6 billion, which is a lot of money. But
it's more than that.
Yeah, but it's got to be more than that.
No.
That's the people who have
a multiple of
showed
that.
up. It's got to be. I think that's right. There are estimates that it is multiples of that. I think we need to. It rankles me when people don't pay. So I'm happy, as I've said publicly, to take the unwilling to pay. Willing to pay people who have trouble, we ought to work with. We have installment agreements. There are ways we can help you try to get to be compliant if you want to be compliant. We ought to work with you. If you're unwilling to pay, my view is I'm happy to chase you to the end of the earth and throw you in jail if we can, because it rankles me when you don't pay. And one of the advantages, the important signals we send with FATCA is to the average taxpayer who's paying his taxes. He no longer has to think, if I had a really fancy attorney and had a lot of money and a really fancy accountant, I could hide my money and I wouldn't have to pay
Just
taxes.
like those other guys did.
Just like those other guys.
Yeah.
And so what I want the average taxpayer to feel is if they're trying to do that, the IRS is out after them. and then we are going to be out after them.
Yeah. Back in our oversight hearing in February, you mentioned a couple of things that piqued my curiosity. First, you said that you weren't at liberty to discuss personnel issues, and then second, because of some union agreements, that you were basically forced to pay these bonuses that have already been brought up once in this hearing. So what exactly is it that precludes you from being able to discuss with the Oversight Committee personnel issues?
Personnel issues is not just the IRS. No agency can talk. In fact, no private sector company that doesn't want to get sued can talk about personnel questions. You see it in universities all the time. That is, basically, if there's an individual personnel action, privacy protections allow people to, in fact, unless, obviously you don't have any privacy if you're indicted and have a public trial. But across the government, if somebody has a personnel action taken, that's a private matter.
Is there anything that could be done from our standpoint? You were talking a minute ago about seeking approval for things like correctable errors, those certain types of authority that you don't presently have. Is there something along the line? I guess what I'm getting to is, doesn't it make sense that the commissioner of the IRS should be able to have a conversation with a committee like this? In the eyes of the public, when there are personnel shortcomings, obvious personnel shortcomings, that for a variety of reasons are just not being, properly addressed? I'll leave it there.
Well, as I say, the decision has been made far beyond the IRS or this area that, in fact, personnel matters are personal, and as I say, in the private sector as well. If actions are taken against individual people, as a general matter, those are held to be private, to protect the privacy of the individual. But
you guys have a whistleblower program?
Pardon?
You have a whistleblower program?
We have a whistleblower program, which I'm a big supporter of.
How long has it been in place?
The whistleblower program has been there for some years.
Does it reward people for helping discover, expose, if you will?
Yes.
People that are that are conducting themselves improperly?
It does, but it's also provided. One of the complications of it is that we can't. The whistleblower report just came out, and it's taken a while to aggregate enough statistics, so we were not reporting in the whistleblower report the taxpayers that, in fact, were identified. Again, taxpayer information is under Section 6103 protected. So when we deal with the whistleblowers, it's more complicated than it would be if we could just say, as you can imagine, why? Because if somebody says General Motors has been cheating, General Motors may or may not have been cheating, and to have that out in the public domain at the front end is a problem. But we do pay a lot of money. As I say, I'm a big believer in it, primarily because when there are large, complicated corporations, and if somebody's deciding to cut corners, I'd like them to worry a little that there are a lot of people know about that, lawyers, accountants, people in the finance department, and somebody might turn them in and get a big payment, and that might be an incentive for it. And so that's why I think it's a great program.
Finally, my last question: in a perfect world, if you were running things, king for the day, whatever you call it, although I think there are some people that think that the IRS is a monarchy, what would the ideal, I'm only talking on the individual side now, what would the ideal return look like to you?
I would preface this by saying, as I always do, tax policy is the Treasury Department, the administration, and the Congress. But having said that, the ideal return would say, this is my gross income.
Send it to us?
Pardon? Not send all of it, no.
Okay.
Just send part of it. As my gross income, I might say, and this is my family situation of a few deductions, I multiply it by a number, and I send in a check.
Okay, that's kind of like flat tax. That sounds like flat tax.
Well, the problem with the flat tax is it got a bad name because people call it a flat tax. Because most flat taxes are progressive. They would say there's a 10% rate, a 12%, 14, or 18. There's usually three of them. And I've always thought people who support simplification would do better not calling it a flat tax, just calling it a simple tax. Because nobody would propose that a millionaire ought to pay the same amount of tax as somebody who makes $20,000 a year. So all of the simple tax proponents have usually said 10%, 16, 18, whatever you want. There are usually, somehow 3 always seem to be the number. And so at the bottom of my simple turn, you'd say, okay, I'm above this, so I multiply it by 12, 16, 18, or 10, whatever it might be. So I only say that because I do think tax simplification is an important strategy, and I don't want people to think if it really got simple, it would be just a single flat tax, and then you have a whole lot of arguments for progressive or non-progressive. I think the best arguments to have is about complexity, non-complexity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
I think we have had most of the answers today. I have some questions I'll submit for the record, and Mr. Serrano may as well. One thing I would remind you, we asked in the February hearing, there were some requests made for the record for some information that is still forthcoming. So I just want to remind you of that.
I am unhappy about that. My view is we ought to be responsive and try to get back to you as quick as we can. Again, those answers are prepared. Some other people are, it's the normal process. Every agency goes through that, the Treasury gets to look at it, and then OMB gets to look at them. They always end up not getting changed very much, but it's a process that I can do. But all I can tell you is that I don't think the response time is appropriate. We ought to get back to you quickly, and if you'll send me these questions, I commit to you I'll do the best I can to get you answers quickly.
Well, we appreciate that, and we know you got a tough job I think, ultimately to restore the confidence and credibility of the IRS. And so we want to work with you any way we can to make that happen. Thank you for being here today. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, maybe I'll keep my notes so I can try to remember what I have. Questions we have. Okay, and I'll even give you the pencil. Show you my heart's in the right place.